My husband called me paranoid in front of a room full of strangers. Then I pressed play, and the room went silent. That's the moment I want you to sit in first, before I tell you how I got there. Mark Whitmore, 49 years old, owner of a mid-sized logistics company in Columbus, Ohio, stood beside his attorney and told a judge that I had an overactive imagination about his late-night phone calls. He said it with a small laugh, the kind he used to give me at dinner parties when he wanted a room to like him more than they liked me. The kind that made other people laugh along without knowing why. 22 minutes later, that same judge asked the bailiff to shut the blinds so no one outside the courtroom could hear what was about to play. I remember the exact sound the blinds made, a soft mechanical hum, and I remember thinking that it was the first time in 3 years anyone in that marriage had done something to protect me instead of themselves. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my days finding money that people don't want found. I never once raised my voice at Mark in 11 years of marriage. I never searched his phone out of jealousy. I never followed his car through the streets of our own neighborhood the way women in these stories are so often accused of doing. What I did was far more dangerous to him than any of that. I paid attention, quietly, for a very long time, and I wrote things down. By the time this story ends, you'll know exactly what was on that recording, what it cost him, what it nearly cost me, and why the woman on the other end of those late-night calls is now facing questions of her own from people far less patient with her than I ever was with him. 3 years ago, the calls started as nothing. A soft ping on his phone at 10 at night. A quiet work thing muttered as he stepped onto the back porch, sliding the glass door shut behind him just a little too carefully. I didn't think much of it, not at first. Mark ran a business with drivers on 3 rotating shifts and a warehouse that never fully slept. Late calls were part of the marriage I'd signed up for when I married a man who built something from nothing. What changed, slowly, was the pattern. The calls stopped coming from a number saved under a driver's name Tony, Marcus, one of the dispatch supervisors, and started coming from no name at all. Just digits, unsaved. A small detail that would have meant nothing to anyone who wasn't trained, professionally, to notice the difference between a saved contact and a stranger. He'd angle the phone away from me on the couch, not dramatically, never dramatically, just enough that the screen tilted a few degrees toward the cushions instead of toward me. He'd laugh at something on the other end, and then catch himself mid-laugh, like he'd forgotten, for one unguarded second, that I was still in the room with him. I want to be honest about something most of these stories skip over. I didn't confront him. Not because I was weak, and not because I didn't have the words. I stayed quiet because I already understood, somewhere beneath the level where I let myself fully think about it, that confronting him would only hand him the opportunity to explain it away. And Mark was extraordinarily good at explaining things away. He'd built an entire logistics company on convincing warehouse clients that a shipment 3 days late wasn't really late if you looked at the contract the right way. So I did what I do professionally, without fully deciding to. I started keeping a private ledger. Not of money, yet of moments, dates, times, the particular tone in his voice when he came back inside, warmer than it had been with me all week. I told myself I was probably wrong, the way married women have told themselves that exact sentence for as long as marriage has existed. It's a cheaper thing to believe than being right. I want you to understand who Mark was to me before any of this, because it makes what came later mean something different. He wasn't a cartoon villain in those early years. He drove 2 hours to sit with my mother in a hospital waiting room the week she was first diagnosed. He learned to make her favorite soup from a recipe card in her handwriting, just so she'd have it when chemotherapy made everything else taste like metal. The man on the porch with the tilted phone screen was not a stranger who had walked into my life overnight. He was someone I had built 11 years with, brick by ordinary brick, which is exactly why it took me so long to let myself see what the bricks had quietly become. The first real thread came from something small and almost boring: our joint tax documents. Spread across the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while Mark was at the warehouse, I noticed a business expense category that hadn't existed the year before: a monthly consulting retainer paid to something called Castellano Creative Solutions. $800 a month. Tidy, unremarkable, the kind of line item engineered never to be questioned by anyone who wasn't already looking closely. I was already looking closely. That's the part of me Mark never accounted for. Renee Castellano, 36 years old. A self-described brand consultant whose only visible client, as far as I could determine in one quiet evening of research, was my husband's logistics company. Her invoices described strategic communications for a business that, according to every meeting I had ever sat through with Mark over 11 years, communicated almost entirely through dispatch software, driver group chats, and shouting across a warehouse floor. I didn't tell anyone yet. Not my sister in Cleveland, not my closest friend, Pat Doyle, who had known me since our freshman dorm at Ohio State, and who could read my face better than my own mother ever could. I needed facts before I let myself need comfort. Comfort, I'd learned in my career, has a way of making people stop looking too early. Over the following 4 months, I traced the consulting payments backward and forward through account statements Mark had no idea I still had partial digital access to, thanks to a joint accounting software subscription neither of us had bothered to update since we married. I found a business account he'd opened without listing me as a co-signer, despite Ohio law requiring disclosure of marital assets funded, even partially, by joint income. That account had received 2 transfers from our home equity line, each one just under $10,000, the specific number people choose when they've read somewhere, correctly or not, that 10,000 is the threshold that triggers extra scrutiny. He was moving money in a shape, not randomly, in a shape designed, deliberately, to look like nothing at all to anyone who wasn't trained to see shapes hiding inside numbers. The late-night calls, I now understood with a clarity that felt almost physical, weren't check-ins from a warehouse floor. They were check-ins from a second life he was quietly building a financial floor beneath, one boring, forgettable line item at a time, while telling me over coffee that I'd seemed distracted lately, that I seemed distant, that maybe I should think about talking to someone about my anxiety. That was the sentence that finally made something inside me go still and cold instead of simply hurt. He was pathologizing the very attention that was slowly uncovering him, while spending our home equity on the woman causing it. I remember setting my coffee cup down very carefully, the way you set something down when you don't trust your own hands not to shake. There was a second thread I almost missed entirely, buried in a spreadsheet tab I only opened because a formula error caught my eye. Mark had quietly changed the beneficiary designation on a small Keyman life insurance policy tied to the business, moving it from a joint trust, naming me, to a newly created single-member arrangement 6 months after the Castellano invoices began. On its own, a beneficiary change means very little. Beside everything else, it read like a man clearing the decks, one document at a time, for a life he hadn't told me he was already living. I started cross-referencing dates the way I would for a client's audit, laying the consulting invoices beside the home equity withdrawals, beside the beneficiary paperwork, beside his travel calendar, which he still synced, out of habit, to a shared account from our engagement. Every supplier walkthrough in Charleston lined up, within a day, with a matching charge on a card I wasn't aware he still carried. Every late warehouse night that ran past midnight lined up with a text notification I could see the outline of, but not the contents of, glowing on his lock screen from across the room. None of it, alone, would have held up to a single honest conversation. Together, it held up to nothing else. I want to tell you what it costs a woman to know something and say nothing while she gathers proof, because almost nobody talks about that part out loud. It costs you your face at dinner, every single night, holding an expression of ordinary marriage while your mind runs quiet calculations underneath it. It costs you small talk about his day, delivered with genuine warmth you don't fully understand how you're still capable of producing. By month 6 of my private investigation, I had documented over $31,000 routed toward accounts connected to Renee Castellano, disguised across monthly consulting fees, a marketing conference in Charleston that never once appeared on any conference registry, hotel listing, or vendor database I could find, and a lease deposit on a downtown apartment that used Mark's own company address as a co-signing entity. He was building her a life on paper that touched our joint credit, our joint tax exposure, our joint everything, while I remained legally and financially entangled in every dollar of it without ever having agreed to any of it. That's not simply betrayal in the emotional sense. In Ohio, undisclosed dissipation of marital assets is something a court can claw back during a divorce settlement, but only if you can prove intent, a documented timeline, and a clear financial destination. Suspicion doesn't move a judge. Documentation does. And documentation was the one thing I had spent my entire career learning how to build. I remember, specifically, the night I finally understood the scale of what I was looking at. I was sitting alone at our kitchen table at nearly 1 a.m, his consulting invoices open on one laptop screen, our mortgage statement open on the other, and I realized, all at once, that the home equity line he'd drained twice was the exact same account we'd opened 4 years earlier to pay for my mother's hospice care in her final months. He had repurposed the account we built for my mother's dying into a slush fund for his affair. I sat with that fact for a long time, the house silent around me, the refrigerator humming somewhere behind me. I didn't cry that night, and I remember that specifically, because I had expected to. Instead, I opened a new folder on an external hard drive that never once touched our home network, and I named it, plainly, Whitmore Full Picture. I was no longer a wife wondering quietly in the dark. I was building a case file, methodically, the way I'd built dozens of them for other people's ruined finances over the years, never once imagining I'd need the skill for my own life. The recording started almost by accident, in a way that still feels, looking back, like the universe deciding I had waited long enough. Ohio is a one-party consent state, meaning I was legally permitted to record any conversation I was a participant in without informing the other party. I didn't yet understand how much that single legal fact would come to matter. One cold October night, Mark took a call on the back porch and left his phone's video doorbell application open on the kitchen counter, forgetting that it also captured ambient audio from the porch microphone whenever motion triggered it. I wasn't spying on him in that moment. I was standing 3 feet away, filling the kettle, when the app pinged and began recording automatically, exactly as it always did when someone stepped near the door. What came through the small speaker wasn't ambiguous, and it wasn't a business call about a delayed shipment. It was Mark's voice, unmistakable, low and warm in a register I hadn't heard directed at me in well over a year, telling someone named Renee that it would all be worth it once the fourth quarter numbers cleared, and that he just needed 6 more months before he could make it official. Make what official? That single question sat lodged in my chest for 3 full days before I let myself write it down in the ledger, in careful, unemotional handwriting, the way I'd write down a discrepancy in a stranger's tax filing. I started deliberately preserving what the doorbell app captured after that night, downloading the clips before the app's automatic 7-day deletion cycle could erase them, storing time-stamped copies on that same external drive alongside the growing folder of financial documents. I wasn't hacking anything, and I wasn't planting devices in our own home. I was simply refusing to let evidence that existed lawfully, in the house I paid half of, disappear before I understood what it meant. Over the following weeks, 4 more clips came through the same accidental channel. In one, Mark used the phrase, "Once Diane signs off on the refinance, we're clear." I didn't yet know what refinance he meant. Our mortgage was fixed, untouched, boring in exactly the way a mortgage should be. I called our lender the next morning under the pretense of a routine account check, keeping my voice light, curious, harmless, and I learned that Mark had submitted a preliminary application to refinance our home solely under his own name, using a durable power of attorney document bearing my signature that I had never, at any point, signed. I want to pause here for a second, because this is usually the moment people ask me the hardest question. If you'd been standing in that kitchen with me, forged signature staring back at you, phone still warm in your hand, would you have kept recording quietly and built the case? Or would you have confronted him right there? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. That's the moment I stopped being a hurt wife quietly gathering feelings and started being, in Sarah Kensington's words, a plaintiff's best witness. I brought everything to Sarah, a family law attorney in Columbus who specialized in high-asset divorce and, more usefully, had a background in forensic discovery before she ever went to law school. She sat across from me and looked through my folder, the consulting invoices, the equity withdrawals, the audio timestamps, the forged power of attorney application, and said something I will never forget for as long as I live. "Diane, most of my clients bring me feelings. You brought me a case." Sarah moved quickly, the way people move when they recognize evidence they don't often get handed this clean. She filed for an emergency asset freeze on our joint accounts and the home equity line before Mark could complete the refinance, citing documented evidence of dissipation and a fraudulent power of attorney, submission a criminal matter entirely separate from the civil divorce filing itself, and one that would not simply disappear when the marriage did. While Sarah worked the legal front, something else surfaced that I hadn't gone looking for and didn't fully expect. A private investigator Sarah brought in to verify Renee Castellano's business registration discovered that Castellano Creative Solutions listed 2 other consulting clients besides Mark's company. Both were small local businesses whose owners, when discreetly and separately contacted, described arrangements that sounded nearly identical to Mark's: vague monthly invoices, cash-adjacent payments that never quite matched the described services, and, in one case, a business owner who had also become newly, quietly, romantically involved with Renee within the same 18-month window. She wasn't only Mark's secret. She had a pattern, running in parallel across at least 3 separate lives that had no idea they were connected. And patterns, in forensic accounting, are the loudest thing in any room, once you know how to make them visible to people who aren't trained to see them on their own. The investigator, a soft-spoken retired detective named Frank Doyle, no relation to my friend Pat, a coincidence that made us both laugh nervously the first time we realized it flagged something else buried in the state's business filings. Castellano Creative Solutions had been registered and dissolved twice before under slightly different names, each time within months of a client relationship ending. A pattern he described, dryly, as a company built to be forgotten quickly. It wasn't proof of anything criminal on its own. But paired with everything else, it told me Renee wasn't improvising. She had done this shape before. I want to be clear about something, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I never confronted Mark directly. I never raised my voice. I never gave him the chance to see what I already knew before it mattered most for it to stay hidden. I let him keep believing, for 4 more months, that I was simply stressed and distant, words he used so often during that stretch that I started keeping a quiet tally of them in the same ledger, almost as a private joke with myself. I kept working. I kept smiling at dinner, asking about his day, laughing at the right moments. I let him think the late-night calls had gone completely unnoticed, because a man who feels unwatched makes mistakes a watched man never would. He signed a second small withdrawal from a business line of credit exactly 2 weeks after Sarah quietly filed the emergency freeze, a freeze he hadn't been formally notified of yet, because Sarah had requested, and been granted, a short delay in service specifically to preserve one more window of unguarded behavior. That withdrawal, made after the freeze was legally in effect but before formal notice reached him, became one of the single strongest pieces of evidence in the entire case. Not because I baited him into it, and not because I said one word that could ever be construed as encouragement. I simply continued being exactly as unremarkable and distracted as he had already decided I was. And he walked directly into the space I hadn't needed to build a trap for at all. Sarah built the filing around 3 connected pillars: the documented financial trail spanning nearly 2 years, the forged power of attorney application, and the audio evidence recovered lawfully from our own front porch, each one independently damaging on its own, and together nearly impossible for any attorney to explain away in front of a judge who had seen thousands of divorces and knew exactly what desperation sounded like from the other side of the room. Sarah timed the disclosure with real precision. During a routine settlement conference weeks later, Mark's own attorney stood up, confident, almost bored, and told the judge that my concerns about surveillance and paranoia were emotional exaggerations, unsupported by any real evidence, the sort of thing anxious spouses imagine when a marriage grows quiet. Sarah waited exactly 4 seconds after he sat back down, letting the silence stretch just long enough to matter. Then she stood, calm and unhurried, and requested the court's permission to play an exhibit. I had asked her once, weeks earlier, sitting in her office with the blinds drawn against a gray Ohio afternoon, whether I was allowed to feel satisfaction about any of this, whether wanting him to lose felt like something I should be ashamed of. She told me something I've carried since. "You didn't build this outcome out of anger, Diane. You built it out of attention. Those aren't the same thing, and juries and judges can tell the difference." I didn't fully believe her at the time. I believe her completely now. What I never did, through any of it, was let myself imagine the ending. I didn't fantasize about his face when the recording played. I didn't rehearse a speech I'd never actually give him. Revenge built on fantasy tends to leak out early, in a raised eyebrow at the wrong dinner, in a question asked one beat too pointedly. Mine stayed sealed, because I refused to spend it in advance, even in my own head, even alone in the car. The clip that played first wasn't even the most damning one we had. Sarah chose it deliberately, Mark's voice, unmistakable. Telling Renee 6 more months before I can make it official, recorded 11 months prior to that exact court date, which meant the documented timeline of deception stretched back significantly further than even his own attorney had accounted for in his confident opening statement minutes earlier. I watched Mark's face while it played, and I'd spent 11 years learning that face across birthdays, funerals, business dinners, ordinary Tuesdays. I watched it do something I had genuinely never seen it do before. Fully, completely empty out, like a light switching off behind his eyes. His attorney reached over and touched his arm. Mark shook it off, without appearing to notice he'd done it at all. The second clip was shorter, only 14 seconds long. Once Diane signs off on the refinance, we're clear. Sarah didn't editorialize a single word of it. She simply asked the court to formally note that no such sign-off had ever occurred, and that the power of attorney submitted under my forged signature was, per the county prosecutor's now active investigation, a document I had never seen before this proceeding. Then, methodically, she laid out the financial trail across the courtroom's display screen, month by month, dollar by dollar, alongside a photograph obtained entirely lawfully through the private investigator's public-facing surveillance of the downtown apartment leased under Mark's own company address, showing his car parked outside it at 11 at night, twice a week, for 4 consecutive months. I didn't say a single word through any of it. I didn't need to. Sarah had built something no amount of charm, no easy laugh across a dinner table, could ever talk a judge out of, a documented, dated, corroborated shape. The exact same shape I had first noticed, quietly, in one boring tax line item, nearly 2 years before this room, this recess, this moment ever existed. Judge Ferris called for a 15-minute recess before any further exhibits could be introduced. I remember the specific quiet of the hallway outside the courtroom during that recess, Sarah beside me not saying much. Both of us watching Mark and his attorney huddled at the far end near the water fountain, his shoulders pulled in tight in a way I'd never once seen them, not even the week his own father died. When we returned, Mark's attorney requested a private conference before the court went any further. Judge Ferris granted it, but not before noting, for the record, that he found the timeline of the power of attorney submission deeply troubling, and would be referring the matter to the appropriate authorities regardless of how the civil proceedings resolved. That single sentence from the bench told me, before Sarah even leaned over to whisper it, that this was no longer a story only I would carry. It belonged to the record now. The settlement that followed wasn't a negotiation in any real sense. It was a surrender dressed carefully in negotiations clothing. Mark agreed to a division of marital assets weighted heavily in my favor. To account for the documented dissipation Sarah had already proven, beyond reasonable dispute, over $58,000 in provable diverted funds, all of it deducted from his share, before anything else was divided between us. The forged power of attorney became an entirely separate legal matter, one that doesn't simply end when a divorce does. The county prosecutor's office moved forward with charges connected to the fraudulent refinance application, and that case followed its own timeline, far outside my control and, eventually, outside my need to watch it closely. Mark's logistics company, already strained by mounting legal costs, lost 2 of its largest shipping contracts within the following year. After word moved quietly through a small business community that, it turns out, talks a great deal more than most people expect it to. Renee Castellano's situation unraveled on its own separate timeline, one I only heard about secondhand. The 2 other business owners the investigator had identified filed their own formal complaints once each of them realized they weren't isolated, individual cases. What had looked, to each of them separately, like ordinary consulting fees, looked, once pieced together, like something closer to a coordinated pattern of financial entanglement with vulnerable small business owners across an 18-month stretch. I don't know, and I made a deliberate choice not to find out precisely how that resolved. That particular story stopped being mine to carry the day Judge Ferris finally ruled. I kept the house. I kept my mother's name quietly restored on the account that had once funded her hospice care, untouched now by anyone else's decisions ever again. I kept my career, the exact set of unglamorous, patient skills that had let me see clearly what I was looking at. long before anyone else in that courtroom did. People ask me sometimes if I regret not confronting him sooner, not screaming, not throwing something across the kitchen, not giving him the dramatic scene he probably expected from a woman he had already, privately, decided was paranoid. I don't regret it. Not for 1 second. I learned something in 11 years of marriage and 18 months of quiet documentation that I now carry with me into every room I walk into, professional or otherwise. The people who call you paranoid are very often the exact people counting on you not to check. I checked. I wrote it down, patiently, month after month. I waited until the truth could speak louder, and far more calmly than either of us ever could have on our own. The blinds are open again in that courtroom now, I imagine, for someone else's case, someone else's quiet reckoning. Mine ended the day a judge asked for them to be closed, so that the only thing anyone in that room could hear was the truth, in my own husband's voice, calmly, patiently, telling on himself. If you've ever been called too much for simply paying attention, hit subscribe to Revenge Mind Diaries and tell me down in the comments, would you have recorded him? Thanks for watching. Bye.